Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to see so many people here on the first day of classes for many and the third day of classes for law students. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Yude Henteleff. He's been an advocate for human rights for more than 40 years, working on a huge range of human rights issues, including mental and physical disabilities, special needs children, and children's rights, and discrimination in the workplace. He's a founding partner and senior counsel with the legal firm of Bilateral LPP in Winnipeg. And I'll just give you a short list of some of the committees that he works on. He's a member of the Advisory Council of Lawyers for International Human Rights. He's a member of the Professional Advisory Committee of the Learning Disabilities Society of Canada. He's a member of the Mental Health Commission of Canada to do the National Framework Review Committee for Child and Adolescent Mental Health. And as well, he's a member of the Winnipeg Arts Council. In 1997, he was named to the Order of Canada, and in 2008, he received the Human Rights Commitment Award of Manitoba for his work on human rights issues. And most recently, and the reason why he's here today, is because he's the chair of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights Content Advisory Committee and a member of the museum's campaign cabinet. And he's going to talk with us today about the work on the Content Advisory Committee. So please join me in welcoming Yude Henteleff.
Well, I'm delighted to share some thoughts with you about one of the most extraordinary events that, and an ongoing one. I've been at it now for, since 2005, some 7 years, as a participant in the efforts of first the Friends of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, and of course now the museum itself. I want to make it clear that in the course of this presentation, if I express any opinions, they're mine. They're not to be attributed to anyone else. I'm not going to kind of separate the fact from opinion, but when I express my opinion, you'll be fully aware of it. I'm sure you will. Because of limited time, I've had to go through the red pencil as late as this morning. So if on times I sound somewhat disjointed, please forgive me. The late Izzy Asper came up with the idea several years ago of a human rights museum to be located in Winnipeg, and sadly, Izzy never lived to see the reality of that extraordinary dream that he had. And fortunately, his daughter Gail took on the challenge, and she joined that dream becoming a reality by not only members of her family, but also by people such as Mo Levy, Arnie Thorstenson, and Stuart Murray, and so many others across the country. The initial step taken in 2002 to meet this challenge was the establishment of an NGO called the Friends of the Museum. I'm going to reflect to some extent on what they did because it lies at the very heart of what the museum should become. And although I'm a member of the Human Rights Advisory Council of the museum, I have to tell you very candidly that I have no idea at all the extent to which the critically important work that the Friends did in association with their advisors who were preeminent in the field. I have no idea the extent to which the museum has indeed incorporated these critically important work that they did in their own plans for the future. So I felt it was necessary as a precursor to dealing with the efforts of the Content Advisory Committee itself that I share with you some of these thoughts. And hopefully in this way, with enough sharing, perhaps the earth will be moved, so to speak, in order that this does become part of what they think and what they do. It's rather sad, I may say, that as a member of that council, we've never been advised to any extent to what extent these important findings have been now an intrinsic part. Am I still mute?
You're okay.
Are intrinsic part. So the objectives that were established by the Friends Board at its inception, and which continue to be relevant today, are as noted on the screen. To record the evolution of human rights in Canada, to record the failures of countries around the world to protect and advance human rights for its citizens, to explore the means by which every individual right to dignity and equality was to be respected and guaranteed, with particular reference to the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, as well as to the 9 core international human rights treaties, and with particular reference, of course, to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And this is critically important to not only further the advancement and understanding of human rights in all its dimensions, but also encourage all to take responsibility and act upon it. Ultimately, as you may be aware, it became known as a museum for human rights. It doesn't mean to say that the museum will take any particular position on any aspect of human rights, but its responsibility will be to share such information which will provide the greatest enablement to as many people as possible in order that they should become informed advocates. And that's the only basis upon which their advocacy can be successful. And from the very beginning, and this is quite novel, the proposed museum was envisioned as an idea museum. The only museum I've ever seen which indeed encompasses that to the extent that this museum hopefully will, is the new News Museum in Washington. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. It's only been open about a year and a half. It's quite extraordinary in terms of not only how it shares its ideas, but the nature and extent of the ideas that are shared in such a way that they encourage feedback, which is actively sought out, which is recorded, and which is, if I may say, regurgitated in a variety of forms. And asking the public to continue their story, contribute their stories and ideas, was not only a sure way to provide the museum with a wealth of stories, but it was also an important act for an organization that was to be premised on inclusion, by reaching out to have conversations with people across Canada, but not only to have those conversations, but to record them in such a way that they considered that what they were saying was meaningful to us asking those questions. Indeed, most importantly, and this is critical, the museum has the potential of achieving a significant unifying influence by creating in Canada a shared human rights culture. We don't have that. We're disparate. We're disjointed. And I consider that the museum will be a medium through which hopefully that will move towards that kind of objective. Not in the sense that there'll be one human rights culture shared by all, of course not. But it'll be a diversified one, which indeed will reflect how Canadians across the country have shared their thoughts and ideas. So concurrently with having retained the services of the consultants, Applebaum and Associates, who are renowned throughout the world in terms of the work they've done, including the News Museum I've just mentioned in Washington, but also the Holocaust Museum, and work throughout the world. And so they decided to appoint what they called a Content Advisory Committee, established by the Friends Board, in order to determine how those objectives, which I just detailed, how would they be carried out? How would they be accomplished? And I was asked to be chair of that committee, and most importantly, it represented a number of disciplines from across the country. It was an multidisciplinary group of persons who not only represented Canada regionally, not only had known interest and involvement in human rights, but also represented their own discipline. There's a great variety of disciplines. The results of that committee's work over a period of the next 2 years were incorporated in a report presented by Applebaum and Associates to the Friends Board in 2007. And that report is at the very heart of the subsequent representations which were made by the Friend Board, including to all levels of government, as well as their ultimate decision, and a correct one, that the only way that this could achieve the dimensions that it was entitled to became a national museum. In the course of our work as a committee, we continuously reminded ourselves, and I want to make sure we get this next one, yes, that no success in human rights is permanent, as the accomplishments of one age are so often swept away by the abuses of another. Conflict abounds not only between those who seek human rights and those who resist them, but also amongst those who seek them, who disagree about the method, and even also about the goals of their search. And therefore, having in mind the foregoing concerns, it was essential that we identify as a committee the basic premises upon which the foundation of the proposed museum would rest. And some of the points that were made in the 2007 report, which by and large reflected our input. It was an extraordinary joint venture between the Friends Board, between the consultants, and between us as individuals, as a committee. Our first concern was there was no consensus, and still isn't, by the way. I have to tell you that I'm about to share with you as to what we consider human rights to be, still has not found its way into the work of the museum. It seems to have got lost somewhere in an area which perhaps is floating the cloud above us. but certainly no rain has fallen, watering the minds and thoughts and ideas of those who are, if I can use the metaphor, who are have in charge now of the museum's future. The 2000 report proposed that the museum deal with this designated zone of the museum by way of an introduction to human rights, and you'll see the details we went to in determining what that should be. May I ask you not to take notes, if you don't mind, because this is going to be online, I'm told, and you can access it then. And I hate to, have you talk and write at the same time, or me talk and you write, because I think somehow or other the two won't commingle. Human rights are rights which we all have simply by virtue of being human. They're inherent, they're universal, and they're inalienable. Fundamental concepts and principles that human rights embody the dignity, worth, and equality of all people. Human rights are life rights. They pertain to our ordinary experiences and everyday events. Human rights depend on a culture of rights, on our continuing relationship of mutual respect and responsibility. Human rights as defined in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Human rights in Canada is defined by all legislation, including that of Quebec, which of course precedes the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as well as human rights codes provincially and federally. And the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and all that has followed its enactment in 1982, whether by legislation or court decision. Now, there may be other aspects of it. I'm sure there will be. But this is what we came together with our collective thoughts as to what we felt was embodied by the concept of human rights. And the 2000 report also proposed this area of the museum also examined personal attitudes and perceptions regarding human rights, challenged preconceived notions to broaden awareness and understanding, recognize and underline the differing moral, cultural, religious, and ethical compass of Canada, consider the role of every individual, and this is really critically important, as a defender of human rights, not as an advocate, as a defender. We really wrestled with how should we describe what your and my responsibility should be. And we finally decided that the most appropriate word in order to encompass what we felt should be shared and individual responsibility of all Canadians would be that you would, each of you, be a defender of human rights. The report also urged that particular consideration be given to the Aboriginal communities in Canada as the First Nation of this country, and I'm happy to tell you that's occurring. And to deal with such issues, the history of encounter and its coexistence, the separate worlds in which the Aboriginal communities live as compared to other communities, the continuing unequal relationship with other communities in Canada, and the ongoing struggle, which seems to have to go on forever before the appropriate results are achieved, for the right to be recognized and dealt with, indeed, as First Nations in this country. The report also emphasizes the centrality of the Holocaust within the museum, and I'll deal with this issue later, which causes me great concern as to what indeed appears to be happening. The Holocaust caused international recognition of the concept of our common humanity, the notion that the human species are one. This recognition, which is sometimes referred to as the Humanity Revolution, arose not just from the revulsion of what happened to Jews and other targets of annihilation, but also the realization that having no concept of, and therefore no respect for common human dignity, hurts all of humanity. It's a cancer without limitation. Once that cancer is embedded, it can't help but encroach the body politic. We all have a vested interest. As long as any group of people is deemed to be less than others, then we all face the extinction of humanity that one day, any day, may come to pass. Hopefully our shared understanding of what comprises human rights will ultimately give us the best answer to achieving justice and equality for and dignity for all, and that's why we address what we thought would be encompassed by the whole concept of what human rights should mean to each of us in a very personal way. The report went on in some detail to discuss the Canadian human rights journey and the human rights evolution in Canada. This should be reflected within another zone of the museum, and in particular, human rights abuses and processes through stories from Canada's various communities, past and present, how structures of inequality gave rise to episodes of the most horrible human rights violations, many of which haven't still been rectified. We of course, get the more recent apologies after 20 or 30 or 40 years have passed by. Much too late, much too little in terms of our full, complete understanding I remember visiting one of those communities to which Japanese Canadians were sent to concentration camps. There were no less than that in interior British Columbia. And what really overwhelmed me, I have to be very frank about this, was the extent to which the Japanese people, Canadians, built exquisite gardens in those communities to honor those who helped them. I'm not sure if I would have had the capacity to recognize those who did what they did to me by destroying my property, by destroying my culture, by destroying my families, by separating families. I'm not sure I would have had the ability to do that. And that really overwhelmed me with their humanity in so doing. And again, as I mentioned, I have no idea to the extent to which what I've just shared with you as to what comprises human rights and what ought to be investigated now forms part of what is driving the Human Rights Museum. There was a hiatus between the spring of 2000 and the fall of 2008, during which time the Friends sought to secure the involvement and contribution by the City of Winnipeg, the Province of Manitoba, and the Government of Canada in establishing a Canadian Museum for Human Rights. And ultimately, of course, as you know, it did. It's really important to note that the museum would be the first national museum to be established in Canada since 1967, only the fifth since 1867. It not only would be the first national museum to be established outside of the national capital region, but is also the first comprehensive human rights museum in the world. Just think of that. I mean, it's mind-boggling in terms of what it will encompass. And more than that, and critically important, it would not only be the first national museum to be established with contributions from government, but extraordinary contributions from the private sector. No other national museum has ever had that as part of what it's done. And we raised over $130 million. I mean, when you think of that, it's remarkable. Yet the criticism that has emerged by virtue of the fact that there have been some very modest overruns totally ignores the fact that there's been extraordinary contribution by citizens from every part of Canada. I can't understand the limitations of those who offer those kind of criticisms. Where are they in terms of recognizing what this has done, this incredible, unique partnership? And it was a partnership not only between the funders and the government and the Friends, but it was a partnership with every Canadian from all across this country who gave money towards this end. If ever you wanted to feel that there has been a commitment by Canadians across this country to something that they held in common, namely the desire for an institution that will advance the cause of human rights in all its dimensions, here it is. So my understanding of why this has emerged is I simply can't come to grips with it because I don't understand that. When indeed the Museum Act was amended, it was by unanimous vote in the House of Commons. And it was really quite extraordinary. There wasn't a single individual who didn't vote for it in the House of Commons. And it sets out the purposes of the CMHR, which is to explore the subject of human rights with special but not exclusive reference to Canada in order to enhance the public's understanding of human rights, to promote respect for others, and this is the critical part, to encourage reflection and dialogue. This is not a static place. It's not going to be a place where you're going to come and see artifacts. There will be artifacts, of course. But I want to go back to what I said earlier about it being an idea museum. And the Museum Act provides particular guidance about its overall role of national museums. Section 3 of the Act contains this declaration, that the heritage of Canada and all its people is an important part of the world heritage and must be preserved for present and future generations. As with all Canadian national museums, the Board of Trustees issued this statement and said that the CMHR will play an important part in preserving and promoting our heritage at home and abroad, contributing to the collective memory and sense of identity of all Canadians, inspiring research, learning, and entertainment that belong to all Canadians. Now, I mentioned that in 2007, Applebaum and Associates provided their report to the Friends of the Board. And in due course, as I mentioned, that has been reposited in the hands of the museum. That was the end of the work of the Content Advisory Committee. We had done our work up to that point. So we felt that our work was still largely unfinished. And so we, if you'll mind my use of a word, Jewish word, chutzpah, nerve, we had the nerve to approach the Board of Trustees and say to them, you still need us. And luckily they're wise enough to acknowledge that indeed they did. And sometimes, quite frankly, you have to have nerve in order to advance a particular cause. And so they agreed not only to have some of us who were on the previous committee stay on, but we expanded the committee to 17 people to reflect both Canada regionally as well as in terms of expertise. And we were instructed to go across Canada, discuss with Canadians their stories, their thoughts, their ideas, their feelings about the museum. And our work was to commence in January of 2009 and to complete it by February 2010. Quite frankly, at that time, what we considered to be an impossible task. It was really something that we had to say to ourselves, how are we going to do this in a meaningful way? So we held 3 preliminary meetings, and beforehand we decided what questions it is that we should pose to Canadians for their consideration. I may tell you that this was a real departure from what usually is the case. You know, authority tends to be firmly in the hands of the museum expert, so to speak, the exclusion of others. And I have to tell you that our appointment was met with some opposition by bureaucrats. They didn't want us encroaching upon what they considered to be their exclusive field. But nevertheless, thank goodness for the Board of Trustees and their wisdom, they agreed that we should be appointed. And we visited 3 communities at the beginning. We visited Saskatoon, Iqaluit, and Ottawa. We felt this would be a good combination for us in May and June to test the market, so to speak. The response just blew us out of the water. And we didn't have much time, you know, to go and find out and to let people know that we were coming and what we wanted to talk about. And the response in places, whether large or small, was just quite extraordinary. And the things that we heard were so unbelievably moving. I will never forget in Saskatoon the 2 women as volunteers who came to address on the issue of missing Aboriginal women. And we now know the story better than we did before, but this was a few years ago, and the story was not well known. They received no funding. They did everything themselves. And they'd been searching already for 2 or 3 years for those women who'd gone missing and had never been found, and still aren't found, because the authorities simply felt this was not an issue that was of particular importance. After all, they're Indigenous women and they were prostitutes and so, or whatever, and so who cares? There were times when what was shared with us was so moving that we actually had a hard time dealing with it. Indeed, at one point, I have to tell you that we asked for some professional assistance to give some guidance, because you can't help but not be moved by this. You can't feel your heart sort of tearing apart at some of the stories that we heard. But we also had to retain, as much as we could, our objectivity, because our task was to share with you and with all Canadians what it is that we've heard. We determined that the public engagement process had 4 main objectives: identifying stories. I'm not sure I'm the right one. Yes, thank you. Identifying stories, controversy, discussion, and issues to be incorporated into the content of the museum. Building public confidence. I want to remember that, because I'm going to refer to the extent to which I don't know, even at this point, 1.5 years or nearly 2 years after our report was provided, the extent to which our recommendations indeed are being given any consideration, or whether they're being incorporated. I can't tell you that. I asked the question in October of last year, and the answer I got was that the 48 recommendations that our report ultimately made and reported on in May of 2010, 3 have been implemented and 45 are receiving ongoing consideration. I don't know what that means. I mean, is it 1%? Is it 3%? Is it 20%? Is it 1 year away? Is it 2 years away? Are some being rejected? Are some not being rejected? I can't share that with you because I don't know. So here were the 4 main objectives. Building public confidence in the work of the museum. Well, that gives me a problem at this point in time for some of the reasons I've now given you and additional ones in a moment. Developing the framework for ongoing dialogue. establishing credibility with other museums and human rights organizations. We had considerable discussion about what questions we should ask, and the first time around in the three preliminary meetings that we had, as I mentioned to you, we had about 10 questions. And they were all relevant, but you couldn't ask people, to sit down and consider 10 questions. I mean, I suppose we could have, and we did, but by and large, what this simply did was it overwhelmed them. And I'm not saying that in a critical sense. It kind of overwhelmed us. And so we struggled with it. We ultimately came up with 4 questions. What stories do you think need to be in the Canadian Museum for Human Rights? What would you be disappointed about if they were missing? Are there specific events that you or your group sees as a human rights success or failure? What do you see as our human rights challenges of the future? Do you have suggestions for who we should interview for personal stories? Objects or images you believe are iconic of particular human rights stories and trigger a particular emotional response? Specific things we should feature in the museum, such as objects, documents, photographs, film, videos, diaries, journals, and the like. Do you know where we can find these? Now, the meetings were never meant to be a statistical or scientific exercise, but rather to invite a broad and timely representation by individuals and organizations. And so we then began our meetings, and although there were 17 of us, there was always a variation in those who went to a particular... I was there as chair to all the 21 communities that we visited, and it was over a period of 10 months, from St. John, Newfoundland, to Chicoutimi, to Iqaluit, to Winnipeg, to Saskatoon, Edmonton, Vancouver, and some places in between. We saw and heard from a Canada that nobody had ever before met for the purpose of discussing human rights. Just think about that. It was moving beyond belief. It was informative to an extent which just staggered us. There was every aspect of the community, from arts, from science, from universities, from high schools, from NGOs of every kind of dimension you could think of. And we saw a picture of Canada and its wishes and desires that nobody had ever measured before in that way, in that intimate, warm, inviting, co-participatory fashion. I have to tell you that one of the meetings which just really, I guess, staggered me was Montreal. About 400 people attended. The place was jammed. We thought maybe we would get 50 or 60. Well, you can understand why. After Meech Lake, after other things, there was a real great separation between our charter, our collective Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and, of course, Quebec. 4 young people came up to me afterwards and said, we never ever thought we'd ever come to Winnipeg to see anything. When the museum is built, we're coming. We're promising you. I mean, this was really moving when you had young people like that. And of course, half or 3/4 of the table were in French. The way we worked this was as follows. We had what were called bilateral meetings, and those were held during the day, and usually in the hotel. And every person who we wished to invite for those particular intensive meetings were there, or some invited themselves. And it was very informal. We were trying to be informal as possible. If what the person had to say we felt needed enlargement, immediately adjacent to that, we had a video room with a trained person to further the information that we received. And so all of this was taped. Hundreds of people from across Canada, they all formed part of the archives of the museum. I mean, you can't imagine how valuable this is in terms of future reference for students from a huge variety of fields. The second thing was, and in some communities, there were so many people who wanted to see us that indeed we had 2 groups of CAC members going on at the same time. And all we could give them was a half hour. And you have no idea how tough it is to deal with the most intimate matters and feelings in a half hour. And they always ran over. And we were just going with a minute between each meeting. In the evening of that same day, we'd have a public meeting. And without exception, whether in Saskatoon or Chicoutimi, the place was filled. They had tables with trained persons there leading the question. They had received the 4 questions in advance. Again, everything was taped. People who very rarely knew each other. And the most extraordinary dialogue began to occur between these people who you could see had wanted to talk about these issues, had never had the opportunity to really share, yes, perhaps, in an intimate way with 1 or 2 of their friends, but never with the public of which they were part. And indeed, in many instances, they stayed on after the formal time was finished. So what would happen is that the person who was trained to conduct these kind of meetings would then report on the conclusions which each party received, each group had made on respect to those 4 questions, and those were consolidated and shared and formed part of our report. The 48 recommendations which I referred to earlier are the results of what it is that Canadians felt, not what we felt. We were the recorders, we were the inquirers, but it's their feelings, their thoughts, their ideas that are reflected in this report. We visited, as I mentioned, 21 communities across Canada. We heard from over 2,000 Canadians. Just think of that. From every walk of life. Time only permits me to share a few thoughts. But what we had to deal with, and just think of the responsibility we had. They were honest. They were forthright. They were challenging. They were inquiring. They were concerned. They were fearful. Let me tell you, were they fearful? What is Canada going to become for us? What is Canada going to become for the rest of the world? Is it going to be what we thought it was going to be, or is it going to be something less than that? They were uncertain as to what the future would hold, but the perpetual message in every place was the museum must be a place of hope. Must be a place of hope. So I'll share a few thoughts with you by some of the people who were with us. Asna Adami, a journalist, poet, and filmmaker, told us in Halifax that, and I quote, "It's not enough to have a place that collects the horrific things that we as human beings do to one another. We need also to create a space that grows from the learning of those experiences, that defines the gifts of the sacrifices of the people that have endured these things with honor and with respect." Natalie Mangay of the Canadian Sikh Coalition in Vancouver said this, "I want to get across, you think it won't happen to you, but it can. You don't know when things are going to change. We did say never again, but it continues to happen. Your life can change within a second." Mark Cooley, a teacher in Winnipeg, said, "If you say that one person's suffering is more important than another's, you deny the validity of that person's experience. That's the thin edge of the wedge that allows genocide to happen." In Montreal, Bill Baldwin noted to us that a museum for human rights that only talks about things in the past would be nonsense. The Honorable René Dussault said in Quebec that we need to, quote, "create a museum that influences the future. This entails getting people to think about the differences that frighten them, that seem foreign to them." Karen Hamilton of the Canadian Council of Churches told us, and I quote, "Human right is based on hope. If we didn't believe it's possible to move forward, there wouldn't be human rights. This museum wouldn't be being built." And Brian Barty and Ruth Noel in St. John's said simply, "The museum needs to tell stories of hope." Look, let's understand something, and this is what they also shared with us, that human rights are not static. Human rights are in constant evolution. Therefore, though the museum, through its exhibits, programs, education, and research, using all the lens described in the report, and I'll describe one in a particular moment, namely the human rights lens or cultural lens, must remain relevant by encouraging ongoing reflection and dialogue. If it doesn't do that, we will betray the faith of Canadians who shared their stories with us. To achieve the objectives which I outlined earlier, it was recommended in our report, which was provided to the Board of Trustees on May of 2010, exactly as promised, that every decision regarding content must be made through a human rights lens. As noted in our report, a human rights lens is more than a strategy or tool. It involves both individual and collective commitments. Employing a human rights lens means you notice when certain groups of people are excluded or treated unfairly or appropriately, and then you must be moved to find out why and do something about it. It means you're able to reflect on whether you're thinking or acting as if others are somehow lesser than you. How often have you not considered you are considered as if you are not humane, that you're not a person, that somehow you're evil, that somehow you're less than others. I'll tell you a quick story. It goes back to a Jewish immigrant in 1917. And he couldn't get a job in the city, so he went to work for a farmer. And he had a huge head of hair. And he asked the farmer one day if he could go and get a haircut in the neighboring town, which he did. And when he got back, the farmer looked at him and said, "Can I touch your head?" He touched his head. He said, "Where are they?" And the Jewish person said, "Where what? Where are your horns?" "You Jews are children of the devil. We know that. What happened to your horns?" If you think that, for example, the blood libel, that children's young blood, non-Jewish, are used to make up matzah during Passover, you're wrong. There are some people who still believe that. The nature of the beliefs that we have about those who are strange to us, who are different from us, are still alive and well. Just in Victoria, day before yesterday, in the Jewish cemetery, 12 or 14 headstones were marked with the swastika. Why is this happening? Where does it come from? Why does a young boy take a lighter to the hair of a young Jewish girl in this town? Why does that happen? And it's not only to Jews, of course, that this kind of discrimination and racism occurs. It's so often just simply because you perceive someone as being different. Applying a human rights lens effectively and consistently requires there to be a permanent member of staff who has long time recognized comprehensive knowledge of human rights both nationally and internationally to do so. After all, this is a human rights museum. But after 3 years, and I have to tell you with more than one reminder, there is still not such a person on staff. I mean, just think of it. To me, it's incomprehensible that indeed, after all this time, there's no such person who's giving the leadership and direction that's so essential to a museum for human rights. Additionally, as noted in our report of May 2010, the museum must strive to establish a human rights culture as an intrinsic part of the museum, a culture that is intended to be shared with all and which will become an ongoing commitment within Canadian society. This doesn't only require a moral and philosophical commitment to defend human rights, but personal engagement and personal practical steps that can secure and defend and advance human rights. But again, if you don't have a person with that kind of acknowledged recognition and expertise, as some other institutions have been able to do, there's no such person within the staff of the museum. And of course, you have to understand the charter is still in a process of evolution, not static. For example, our charter contains no guarantee as to social, economic, and environmental justice. It was pointed out to us that as a result, the right to not live in poverty is not a guaranteed human right. Sharon Murphy of the NGO Canada Without Poverty stated to us, poverty is the biggest human rights violation in Canada. And for those of you who don't know, the original author, the prime author of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights was a Professor Humphreys from Canada. I'm not sure how many of you are aware of that. He was a major mover and shaker together with Eleanor Roosevelt in the situation. And this is what he said, the author of that. He said, human rights, in his memoirs, he said, human rights without economic and social rights have little meaning for most people. And so it's not as if, we have achieved perfection with our charter. More than that, Canada, as you know, although a signatory to many international covenants, has never incorporated them as part of domestic law. And therefore, so much for its commitment when it doesn't indeed do what is necessary to make it enforceable within Canada. So as I noted to you, one of the challenges that confronted the CAC, what is meant by human rights. As noted in the CAC final report, the struggle to claim and defend their human rights by those who are marginalized, despised, and prosecuted is one of the most stirring of all human stories and still so far from being achieved. So we have to ask ourselves these questions. Why are some things recognized as human rights and others are not? Why do some rights achieve formal recognition but are never formally put in place and enforced? What do we do individually and collectively to overcome these barriers? Barriers of such long standing. The answer does not appear to be found in the international human rights regime, nor does it seem to be found in Canada by virtue of the examples that I've given you. Just think of the responsibility that rests upon you as students in law. Because if this doesn't become part of your future and part of your responsibility, then you are not what you are supposed to be as ultimate graduates in law. That responsibility is an intrinsic part of who and what you are. And it's critical that you understand that and nurture it. So one of our concerns about the Museums Act, the Enabling Act, that it didn't define human rights. And we considered it essential that it develop a statement of, so we just considered our own, that we had best come up with a statement of principles and values. And these are included in our report. I may tell you that the Board of Trustees, nor the museum itself at this point, has even addressed that issue in terms of coming up with what it considers to be a statement of principles and values. It's an astounding deficit in a human rights museum not dealing with what should be at its very core. And why it's deficient, I can't answer that question. This is, I can't give you all the recommendations, and of course I urge you to read the report, which should be a valuable part of giving you some guidance as to perhaps the role that you can both collectively and individually play in advancing human rights. Canada is a federal state that its constitutional order provides an established place to Quebec and to First Peoples. The Constitution has recognized both individual and group rights, and our modern Constitution is based on equality of women and men. If you look at every one of those, you'll see how much more we still have to attend to. In particular, I'm really concerned that the museum doesn't have on staff a recognized expert on the evolution of human rights in Quebec, in particular the Quebec Charter, equal to our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We cannot do justice to what is our obligation to reflect within the museum, that evolution in Quebec, which preceded ours, preceded the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and indeed, no doubt, provided, inspiration for that happening. The other area of great concern to me is the centrality of the Holocaust in the museum. And this is reaffirmed in our recommendation. There wasn't a part in Canada, not just from Jews, from a variety of people who said the museum should position the Holocaust as a separate zone showing the centrality of the Holocaust to the overall human rights story. The story of human rights told in other parts of the museum should bring home to visitors the core message of the Holocaust, that respecting human rights gives hope that the Holocaust will ever happen again. If this is in any way diminished, it will significantly impair the museum from carrying out its objectives. And I have great concern because of what appears to be the lumping together of the Holocaust with other genocides, as if it were just another genocide, is an act of diminishment which is totally, completely unjustifiable. We have urged for a long time, indeed, for this purpose, not just for the purpose of the Holocaust section, but because of the fact that its lessons must be reflected throughout the museum, that an acknowledged expert in that field become a member of the permanent staff. For 3 years that's been urged, and it still isn't in place. Why? It's beyond understanding. Indeed, some of you may have read Professor Adam Muller's response to a report in the other newspaper, I can't remember, the National Post. Sorry. Don't quote me, please. I must confess, I'm a Globe person very much, and of course the Free Press. But this is what Professor Muller said. He's a professor at the University of Manitoba, of course, and he said, in response to an article by one Jonathan Kay, he said, the museum seeks to promote understanding of the history of the emergence of human rights as a concept and as an organizing principle in law and society, and this understanding, and I'll say this very slowly, for a variety of historically contingent reasons, remains crucially tied to the legacy of the Holocaust. In closing, let me say this. For the CAC, human rights principles and practice derive for profound respect for human dignity and our common humanity. Reaching common ground between diverse philosophical and cultural traditions that honor these values is possible if we collectively attend our minds, thoughts, and efforts to that. We believe that the museum's mandate to promote respect for others and encourage reflection and dialogue necessarily entails efforts to find that common ground and to meaningfully engage the public on an ongoing basis to do so as well. However, the extent to which needed staff are not yet in place after all this time, the extent to which the CAC recommendations have not been dealt with after all this time, as well as the extraordinary delay in delivering the content of the museum, leads me to believe that although we may have an iconic building, we may very well end up at some time in the future, and who knows when now, with content that is banal, that is mediocre, and what a tragedy that would be. Thank you. Yes, please.
I was interested that you deplored the fact that the law setting up the museum did not include a definition of human rights. Because of reading that I've done, for example, Michael Ignatieff suggests that only a minimal definition of human rights is going to get agreement. As soon as you start trying to define it in more detail, the right not to live in poverty then has to be balanced by the right to own property, and it gets more and more convoluted and harder to get agreement. I've read one theorist who suggested that it's pretty clear that the people who wrote up the UN Declaration all probably meant something very, very different by human rights, and all interpreted what they were doing very differently. So I wonder what you think of that argument that avoiding definition in that case might have been a wise move, leaving it open to debate, discussion, reflection, as an ideas museum can do, might actually serve the purpose better.
Let me give an example of the difficulty that arises, which you identify. I've taken interest in the issue of palliative care recently. And those who have been advancing that cause as a human right had relied upon the UDHR and its use of the word dignity in attempting to use that as a legal basis upon which to achieve their objective, namely palliative care as a compellable human right. When I was asked to comment on that, I had the benefit of some decisions by the Supreme Court of Canada, which at one time had relied upon the loss of dignity as being one of the means by which you measure whether indeed your rights have been limited or not. They subsequently decided that it was a morass, which they couldn't get into because it was incapable of definition. And I told them that that was not the way to do it, that there were other ways of doing it, and that, for example, when you examine the Canadian Health Act, by its very nature of excluding palliative care from insured care and putting it into the area of extended care, where it is at the option of the province, by its very nature, by virtue of the fact of the nature of the disease which requires care, you're distinguishing one from another, and therefore it's discriminatory. There was a more sensitive issue, and when you look at the extent to which persons who require palliative care, you'll notice that about 90% of them will have as the source of the need for palliative care cancer. And so one can't be critical of what those who have advanced palliative care for people with cancer, you can't diminish their efforts. On the other hand, when you see a disproportionality like that, then clearly again, the courts say there can't be that kind of disproportionality, and the cases have said so. And that, again, by its very nature, it's by nature of the nature of the disability that you're being discriminated against. So there are many other bases upon which you can do that. And I suggested a means by which they could come up with a definition, indeed, which would be of assistance to them. And I focus on the whole area of meaningful access as being a principle of law which ought to be advanced, rather than dignity. Because I can't recall, somebody said it was idiocy on I can't recall the quote, but he said that it was impossible and really impossible to define what dignity. In terms of human rights, it is capable of definition. The UDHR did it. It requires change, because you're perfectly right. It doesn't reflect issues that it should reflect. That doesn't mean to say we shouldn't try. And that's why we felt that it was critical to at least advance for people's consideration what we thought was encompassed by human rights. Now, you can be so generalized about it that it ends up meaning nothing. And so of what use is it if there isn't a clear understanding of what it means?
Trying to formulate it as a question. It's a bit of a comment, but and maybe it's just more whether you agree or not. My own view about the museum has always been that if it's not a place of where people are, frankly, out in front of it picketing or concerned about what's happening there or debating it inside and outside the museum, then I don't think it's doing its job. I actually think human rights are contested. I mean, it's just, I think, foolish and just unrealistic to think that human rights aren't going to be, the whole notion of what are, when you get down to defining them, what are human rights and how they actually apply, it's obvious to me, and I think to a lot of people, that those are contested. Now, there are certain points of principle on which you can get broad agreement, and maybe it makes sense for there to be some fairly broad principles, but I think in terms of specific principles or specific, saying there should definitely be an expert in this way, in this issue of human rights or other, I actually think is, well, I mean, we could try that, but I think it's unlikely to achieve what I think is quite exciting about the museum, is that it is going to be a place of, I hope, lots of discussion and debate, changing over time, not static, and really welcoming of critique and different views on what human rights actually mean in practice. Because even if you look at the narrow sector of the legal system and the courts, in terms of not representing all views and perspectives, but a fairly small L liberal perspective, you see lots of divisions among our own courts about how to interpret really quite basic principles like equality. What does that mean on the ground? So I think I'm actually heartened by the fact that we haven't, or at least it appears that there hasn't been an attempt to constrain things too much. Obviously, I think it's important for there to be, I like the role that the Content Advisory Committee has played. I've been quite impressed with the work that the committee has done. But it seems to me that it'd be useful to have an ongoing role in some way, and I'm not sure if you can speak to whether there is or not, but to suggest that we need to sort of set things in stone, I mean, I'm interested in your response to my suggestion that that's not actually going to be helpful. If you are so nebulous as to try and please everybody, so you have to be sufficiently informative in order that there is an issue to debate. You can't, I mean, that's what libraries and research institutes are for and the like, and this will have a substantial research aspect to it. So I think we had 17 people from every different profession. A couple of us knew each other. Most of us didn't know each other. I mean, they were brought together because of their expertise and their location, but primarily their expertise. There were sociologists, psychologists, there were academicians of all kinds. I mean, we were a real mixed bag. We had no trouble in the short times available to us in coming to grips with these profound issues. We had no trouble at all. I mean, that's not true. We had a hell of a lot of trouble. We had a lot of arguments. But ultimately what emerged was a consensus, which we felt was important to share with people in order to give them a basis upon which to advance their thoughts. It's got to be, people coming there have a right to be informed of all of the information which is relevant to the issues which they should address. And you can't do that by saying, well, we'll try some lower common denominator so it doesn't presume too much, or it doesn't make anybody feel badly. But David, if you don't advance thoughts by those who are expert in the field and by general Canadians, what I said earlier was the 48 recommendations are emerged from what we were shared, what we were told. But of course there was some influence by us
in how it was worded and how it was shaped and how it was formed. That's inevitable. But we felt it was necessary to be as concrete as that report is in order to give a firm foundation of information to people upon which, now, they don't have to necessarily accept it. They can go to other places. Nothing, just simply because we say something doesn't mean to say it's written in stone. All it is the most, I'll put it this way, it's the most, what we consider to be, it should be the most enabling environment to enable people to exercise their thoughts and ideas to the maximum degree.
Thank you. I'm here with a small group of architecture students, and I'm wondering if any of your 48 recommendations have had any architectural implications.
We were somewhat presumptuous in some of the things we did and said, but I'm sure we didn't invade the field of architecture. I don't think so. We were concerned about the space. We were concerned about how the space would be used. We were concerned about the chronological order of what should be dealt with in the museum. So the space meant much to us in terms of whether indeed it would have the capacity to convey what we felt should be conveyed. I mean, I had the experience of, recently seeing in Toronto, the one with all the glass in the front. Yeah, the ROM. And when I walked up in there, the angles from the outside were beautiful. On the inside, they were incapable of showing what should be shown. I mean, it was lovely, but so what? If it isn't practical at the same time and useful to the fullest degree possible, in order to be able to share in a way which is dramatic. Now, we considered this quite dramatic. For example, we had much discussion about, within the museum, as some of you may know, there is not stairs, what do you call it? The ramp, sorry, thank you. The ramp goes throughout, and the ramp is most interesting because, at our insistence, it had resting places along the way so that people could stop and observe and think. Other than that, they were simply going to go round and round, but we felt, no, that was essential. Because as you're moving from place to place, you can look back from where you came and then also at the same time look to where you're going. And so there was an interconnection going on all the time in your mind between what you've seen and what you're going to see. At the same time, there were moments to place, to stop and reflect. Yes, in that sense, we were concerned with the space and how we felt it would best enable, I'll go back to that word again. It should be such that it is the most positive enabling factor. You don't want the building to take away on the inside from the drama and the story of what's being told inside. It should enhance it, not in any way take away from it. That was our thought.
Well, this is the first in the series this term in the Critical Conversations, the Idea of a Human Rights series. And there are some of these posters left over, and someone will be handing them out at the back of the room if you'd like to pick one up and take it and post it somewhere. We would have a whole series of seminars this term. Most of them are on Monday afternoons. If you go to the CHRR website, you can sign up. You can find the schedule, but you can also sign up, and we'll send you out reminders of when the seminar series are. And there's one on Monday with Dr. Diane Bryden and Dr. Chris Powell on Monday afternoon here at the Law School in room 206 at 2:30. So we'd welcome you to come. This term the focus is on content. Last term the focus was much more on the theory of the museum. And that was a fantastic start to a set of discussions on content. And again, we invite everybody to come if you want more detailed discussions on content during the rest of the term. And thank you so much for a great send-off today. Yes,